Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're excited to have our second session with Dr. Kramer, The Real Lives of Jews in the Traditional World, and surprises from the special collections of the JTS Library. Many of us know the official version of the lives of Jews through the ages, according to which Jews were pious and thoroughly immersed in Jewish life, a life of part, think Anatevka, but many of the rare materials in the JTS library offer a different picture, according to which Jews lived in the world with their neighbors, experiencing life first as human beings and then as Jews. We are blessed to be joined by Dr. David Cramer, who has been part of the JTS community since 1977, when he enrolled in the graduate school, and he has taught there pretty much ever since getting his PhD in 1984. Dr. Kramer's focus is on the literary analysis of rabbinic literature, rabbinic ritual, and the social and religious history of Jews in late antiquity. He has been the librarian of the seminary since 2004 and has played a crucial role in forging policy and expanding the impact of the world-renowned collections and programs. Of course, Dr. Kramer is also a prolific author and commentator. He has written extensively on all sorts of interesting things, not the least of which is history of kashrut and rabbinic literature. And most importantly, David Cramer, Professor Kramer, was my professor at the seminary. And he systematically will destroy everything that you think you know about a topic and rebuild it in a much more complicated, complex, and beautiful way. So I am excited for Professor Kramer to systemically destroy what we think we know about the history of the Jewish people and remake it in his own image. So without further ado, Professor Kramer.
um, wow. Yes, that was the most important thing I ever did, was have you as a student. Except, of course, for the other students I had here. So I have to be careful about what I say. I actually like what you just said. I mean, it's true. If we think we know something, but the evidence doesn't support it, it's worth deconstructing. But deconstruction for its own sake is not worth it. You have to reconstruct it and show that it's got meaning in the alternative version as well. And I hope that I've taken responsibility to do that. So. Okay, well, I'm just curious, since I don't remember, is there anybody who's here this evening who wasn't here last time? Just like wave your hand. Okay, so a couple of you. Okay, that's fine. I mean, no problem with that. I just wanted to, the foundation that I lay right now will relate to all of you, but I wanted to make sure that those who didn't have a chance to be with us last time would feel welcomed. So one of the purposes of this, I would say there are two fundamental purposes. One is for you to learn something interesting and really contrary to a lot of prior assumptions you may have had. We already saw something of that sort last time. And the other is to develop an appreciation of both what rare materials can teach us, that is to say, those of us who are not only, rarefied scholars who are working on very technical or very obscure questions. I mean, the rare materials have a lot to teach us that are of importance in broad ways, whoever we might be, whatever our background might be. But I'd also like to help you appreciate the rare book collection at the Jewish Theological Seminary, because we do have, as I said last time, one of the few most outstanding collections of rare Judaica manuscripts, rare printed books and like in the world. And we, the Jewish Theological Seminary, have taken responsibility for this collection, for accumulating it, for protecting it, not just because it is the inherited Jewish legacy, but also because we feel that this will forever have new things to teach us. And it's important for us to reconsider, to reevaluate what we think we know, because generation after generation, we develop certain notions, and when we discover that there are alternative ways to analyze the evidence, and there, of course, must be evidence. This just isn't just inventing alternatives. I mean, the evidence actually shows something that might surprise us. It's worth considering what we can learn from the alternative view. Just to illustrate one way that this might work. This has nothing to do with our rare materials as such, but a generation ago, maybe a generation and a half ago, it was commonly assumed that the rabbis, beginning in the first, second century of the Common Era, represented what had for a long time been traditional Judaism. That if you were to think of the relationship between rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, the inherited Judaism, traditional Judaism, was the Judaism that the rabbis inherited and perpetuated, and that Christians and what they began to do, though they claimed to be part of true Israel, nevertheless, that represented a turning aside from what the tradition had been. What we now appreciate, because the evidence supports it, is that the rabbis were in many respects no more traditional than were the early Christians. They both claimed different parts of the inherited tradition. And there are many things that the rabbis offered by way of the way Judaism ought to adapt to the next period after the destruction of the temple that were very, very different from the Judaism that was inherited up to that point from traditional Judaism. So that's one example. It makes a huge difference for the way we think of Jewish history, but also for the way we think of our place in the world. And there will be similar examples in what we will be looking at tonight. So I hope that illustrates where I'll be trying to go. Let me tell you that we will be focusing, as I think you know, on Jews in Italy during what most people know of as the Italian Renaissance. That is to say, the 15th and into the 16th century. This was a period during which Italy was flourishing, and the Jews have often made it their business to locate or relocate in places where the general population flourished and where there was therefore opportunity. We're talking here not just, but to some degree of the generation or so after the expulsion of Jews from Spain. There had been a Jewish community in Italy before that, and the evidence shows that they were doing quite well, but that community was enhanced by folks who were expelled from the Spanish Peninsula, made their new homes in a variety of places, including in northern Italy. And it's fair to say that northern Italy during the late 15th and into the 16th century was one of the best homes that Jews enjoyed for a very, very long period. And as you'll see in a moment, the evidence of the material that we preserve from that time supports what I just said in rather an extraordinary and often a surprising way. The only thing I want to add before I begin showing you the materials is that not surprisingly, it wasn't all good, right? I mean, that's the way of the world. But when we look at this material, and most of it will be from the more affluent classes of Jews, and it's notable that there were affluent Jews, we'll see the degree to which they participated in broader Italian culture. And that's really what I'd like to show you more than anything else, okay? So before we begin to look at materials from the Rare Book Room, anybody have any questions about what I just said? Okay, I can go ahead. Okay, so I am going to share screen. I am going to hope that this comes up, and let me put it on here. I want to do this slideshow and play from start, and you should have a good large screen with a picture of a manuscript page. Do you have that? Yes, and it's labeled JTS Library, Haggadah, and so forth? Yes? Okay, great. You can see the way it's labeled, both the scribe and the year. We know a little bit about this fellow, Yoel Ben Shimon, because he tells us in this very manuscript, it's a very important manuscript. He was an important scribe, and he produced a number of significant manuscripts, in particular Haggadahs. He specialized in Haggadot, right? The script that we use for the Passover Seder. This was an early example of his Haggadot. And he tells us when he signs this particular manuscript that he is an immigrant to Italy from Ashkenaz. So here you've got an Ashkenazi Jew who moved to Italy because of the attractions of what was going on in northern Italy. And he actually tells us his Yiddish name. So his Hebrew name is Yoel Ben Shimon, but the name he was known by was actually Fivush. A good latter day Yiddish theater name, actually. And he was not only the scribe of this manuscript, but he was also the artist of it. And that's unusual. Ordinarily, scribes will write a manuscript, and if the manuscript is meant to be decorated, it will be decorated by an artist who's hired. So if you look at this page, and it is quite a beautiful page, you will see that it is the invitation that comes just before the 4 questions, although Haggadahs during this period were organized a little bit differently than the ones we're familiar with. It's the halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, which our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. And then it goes on to the next page with the rest of the invitation to those who might be needy to come in and join the Seder. I should point out here that this is obviously an important page. The way the word ha in the middle of that funny decoration that occupies most of the page, that centrality and the size of it, we see repeated in halach ma'anya pages in other manuscripts and even in early printed Haggadahs for centuries, actually. And this is because they considered this to be the actual beginning of the Seder. What came before this, the Kiddush and so forth, were merely rituals. The beginning of Haggadah, of Magid, of the recitation, actually began here. And so this was often emphasized both through the size of the letters, through the artwork that appeared. This told us that we are now beginning in earnest. Now, if you look carefully at the decoration around the word ha, you will see that alternative squares have got little round designs. And then in the squares between the round designs, which are repeated, what do we have? And what does it appear like to you? And I please unmute yourselves and just speak up when you want to answer, because I would like your responses here. What do you see in the alternate squares from the top to the bottom of this decoration?
Faces of people.
Faces of people. Is it all faces, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
More complicated.
More complicated. So we certainly see heads of people from
Right.
top to bottom, right?
Right.
What else can we say about these heads and the way they are represented to us?
It appears that 1 or 2 of them are knights.
Yeah, so
Like
first of
women?
all, can you see where my arrow
Yeah.
is? Yes, okay, good. So we've got one here, certainly appears to be one over
And
here. So we've got a couple of them who are dressed in armor. What else do you see?
Bosch demon.
What was that?
A demon right out of a Bosch painting.
Which one are you focusing on there? Tell me where to...
The second row from the top.
Yep.
Okay. You can
So
see a
right.
couple who are apparently wearing costumes, right?
Right.
Animal costumes with hoods and the ears, right?
I guess it's a donkey and not a demon.
It might be. It might be. I mean, the part of this is just speculation. Some have their heads covered, some don't. It's a motley combination. I think we would all agree. Who are these people? What are they meant to represent? What would you guess?
Noble people, high echelon people.
Okay, well, some of them certainly look that way, right? Where my arrow is now, maybe some of that, but
The community.
I think that's fair. Good. Good. I mean, what's interesting and ironic, first of all, if I were to have showed you these individual images and not told you that the images were from a Hebrew manuscript, would you have guessed that these were Jews?
No.
Right?
No.
Not at all.
No.
Not at all. Yet, I think it's clear that what the artist is representing here is the range of individuals, Jewish individuals, who you might see on the street, whom you are inviting to join you at your Seder. What, after all, is the purpose of Halach Ma'anya? So this begins to give us visually a sense of what a Jew looked like in northern Italy in the mid 15th century. And notably, a Jew doesn't look like a Jew, right? Certainly nothing to distinguish a Jew from his neighbor. We'll see more of this as we go on. Now, obviously, there's no representation here, but this is from the same manuscript, quite beautiful, very fine artwork done by Yoel Ben Shimon. You can see the hands up here holding what looks like a curtain bar, I guess, or its equivalent, right? And with beautiful, decorated, elaborately cloth, which here frames and focuses us on the word Hodu, which is part of the Hallel psalm that we recite as part of the Seder. I share this with you, number one, to show the fine artwork that this particular artist, and as we'll see, other Jewish artists were able to do. But again, if we were to remove the Hebrew letter and I were to ask you, where does such a decoration appear? You would say, well, tell me where this page is from. And it's probably meant to be a fine piece of decorative art that represents the fabrics that you might find in the society. Again, aside from the Hebrew word, nothing whatsoever Jewish about it, and clearly part of what the larger culture produces. Okay, now here we've jumped less than 2 decades. All of this, almost all of it, is going to be from the same area, again, northern Italy. And this is one of the first pages, and it's what we would call the title page. There were no title pages on manuscripts, but it announces the book. It's from a Siddur, right? A prayer book that was written, as you can see, in Italy in 1471 from the colophon. That's from the scribe's signature near the end of the book. We learn 2 very important things. First of all, that this was produced by a very notable scribe by the name of Avraham Farisol. His writing, you'll see another page of it, was quite magnificent. And I'll say something about the writing a little bit more. But on this particular page, the artist, and we don't know who the artist was, decorated the page, but as we look at the page, what do we see has happened to the decoration?
Been scraped
It's
off.
been removed.
It's been scraped off, right? It's been defaced, right? And I use that word intentionally here. You'll notice that in these bottom circles,
Right.
what was here was defaced. And I think that word here probably should be taken literally, that these circles were defaced. And instead, someone wrote in Shema Yisrael. You see that Shema over here and Yisrael over here. If you come up to this circle, the person who scraped off the paint didn't succeed in scraping all of it off. And if you look carefully, you can see that it's blue paint at the top, and the bottom, there's green. And then there's a little bit of light brown over here. Manuscript experts who have examined this think that this was probably an image of, and now the second thing we know about this manuscript, it was produced to be given as a gift by a groom to his young bride on the occasion of their marriage. And so we think that what was in these circles was images of the bride or the bride and women, maybe her mother, but other women in her family. We can't be sure. So what seems to have happened is that a later owner, a man, didn't think it was appropriate to have images of women in his Siddur, in his prayer book. And so he scratched them out, he defaced them, and instead exhibited his piety by writing in Shema Israel. But there's another page in this manuscript which he didn't do any damage to and is actually very, very interesting. First of all, I want you to notice the surface features, this beautiful fine pen filigree work, which was very typical of manuscripts produced in Italy at this time, not just Hebrew manuscripts, but Latin manuscripts as well. This was part of the art of producing manuscripts during this period. And then, if you look at the Hebrew writing, those of you who read Hebrew may be able to make it out, but it's got a very particular form. It's very beautifully written. It's not the square writing that you would be likely to see in Bavaria, for example, which was typical in the prayer books that some of us had when we went to Hebrew school a long, long time ago. But it's an elegant, flowing writing, and it imitates a new kind of writing of Latin letters called humanistic writing that had begun in Italy earlier on in this century. So the Hebrew form was influenced by the Latin form in order to make the page more beautiful. On this page, if you can see where I'm pointing my arrow, these two columns here, these are the morning blessings that were originally recited at home, but today are recited in the synagogue. And the first part of this says, this is the abbreviation for Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. And then it goes on and says, Sha'asitani, whoops, there's my arrow, Sha'asitani isha v'lo ish. Blessed be you, Lord God, King of the universe, who made me a woman and not a man. Now, if you go to an Orthodox prayer book today and look at the morning blessings, a man will say, thank you, God, for not making me a woman. And a woman will say what? Does anybody know?
No.
Asati Kirtzon.
Make me according to his will.
Yes,
Women.
exactly. Who made me according to his will, which I think has a kind of begrudging tone to it because, you know, it would have been better if you made me a man, but you did the best you could in this case, right? Remarkably, here in 1471, this young woman said, thank you, God, for making me woman and not a man, right? Absolutely extraordinary. There's only one other manuscript in the world that records this formula. So without these two surviving manuscripts, we would not have known anything about this. And I should add, the fact that it's given to this young woman on the occasion of her wedding tells us that women were literate, they were educated, tells us that women prayed, and it tells us that this woman at least had the spirit to be able to say, I'm going to affirm my womanhood, whatever anybody else is reciting somewhere else. So it's a very surprising expression of a spirit of the Renaissance that, again, in the absence of what we preserve in our collection, we would have no way of knowing that it existed. How many other such things disappeared because no evidence was left? We just can't know. Any question or comment about this before I go on? Okay, now, this is one of a number of pages that I'm going to show you from a very, very important manuscript in our collection. As you can see, it's called the Rothschild Maxor, comes from the same period as what we've been looking at here, 1490 in this case. It is a much, if I use the word large, it'll make it sound like it's, you know, like large pages. It's not very large pages, but there are many pages. So it's a much fatter manuscript, a much more complete manuscript than what we've been looking at up to this point, which was a prayer book and a Haggadah. Maxor, until more recent times, means not a high holiday prayer book, which is the way we use it and probably the way most of you are accustomed to thinking of a Maxor. Maxor, the word literally means cycle. And it can be used for any kind of cycle. So typically Maxori, manuscript Maxors that we preserve, actually provide us with the cycle of prayers and blessings and customs, often for the entire year. And that's what this particular manuscript did. It's called the Rothschild Maxor, not because there was a Rothschild family in Italy in 1490 who owned this, but because it came into the possession of the British Rothschild family and was theirs for several generations. And when the Jewish Theological Seminary had its fire in 1966, which destroyed a large part of our circulating collection, the Rothschild family heard about it, and the library had done a favor for Lord Rothschild earlier in the 50s. One of the Rothschild's manuscripts was stolen during the war, and a disreputable dealer offered it to the librarian, the head of the JTS Library, who recognized it as a stolen work. And so he contacted the State Department, who contacted the Rothschilds, and returned that manuscript to them. And the Rothschilds remembered that favor. So when in 1966, the fire occurred, the Rothschild family got in touch with the library and said, we'd like to help you rebuild. And the way they did that was by gifting us with this manuscript. So it's a wonderful story, and that's where it gets its name from. At the same time, it's perfectly clear that the family that sponsored the production of this manuscript had to be very, very wealthy. And you'll see multiple pages with gold leaf, with very careful decoration and the like. Now, crucially, there's no Hebrew on this page. So if I were to have shown this to you without identifying it, you could easily have guessed that it comes from what kind of setting? What would you have said? Anybody?
It looks like it's from a wealthy family, and the husband and the leader of the home are pointing to their wives and daughters.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I like that interpretation. I mean, you would have to know a little bit more when it was produced and so forth. Of course, unless you're an art historian, you may not have recognized this as distinctly Italian decoration, very typical of manuscripts for this time. What you've done is seen long hair and identified it with women, but of course, as we know, right, men also, right? And what's remarkable here is you've got these like wild men over here, right? You know, wearing fur costumes from neck to ankle and these huge clubs that they're holding, which we would have to, you know, interpret. If you look at the middle here, and I were to ask you, what is this whole thing? The shield with the, you know, I mean, the decoration around it and so forth. And so I say, please, what is that? I don't know why they're doing that. What would you have said? Anybody?
I'd say it was a coat of arms.
Coat of arms, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. There's only one problem with that identification. It clearly looks like a coat of arms, but Jews could not be nobility, right? And it was only nobility who could have coats of arms. What's interesting about this is that not only the family that produced this, but others as well, wealthy Jewish families in northern Italy at this time were so comfortable and thought so highly of themselves that regardless of what the law may have been, they invented their own coats of arms. And they actually decorated their manuscripts and other things. So this is one such coat of arms that a Jewish family created for itself. Okay, I gave you that other page because I wanted you to see a page without Hebrew first. This page here is, I think you'll agree, quite remarkable, right? We'll see some others as well. You can see once again the coat of arms down the bottom, right? You can see the well, actually bottom and top. You can see the extensive gold leaf and decoration. This is the words, actually, this is the Book of Kohelet, which is recited, during the liturgical calendar during Sukkot. So this is probably meant to be King Solomon. But typically, Renaissance painting doesn't remember what King Solomon looked like in the 10th century before the Common Era. It represents royalty of the past, like royalty of the present. So here you've got probably King Solomon and his courtiers. And when you look at their hats, you look at their garments and so forth, there's no doubt that here you've got Jews dressed in common upper class Italian garb, right? Is that clear?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now look at the next here. This is a much more subtle page. The decoration is very, very fine. I should remark that there were actually 4 workshops that worked on the production of this manuscript. It wasn't all one artistic workshop that created all the artwork. There were 4 different ones, but all of them are extremely fine, as you can see here. I love to show this page because of these folks, well, not folks exactly, these images right here, right? What are they?
Cupids.
Cupids or
Well, they
angels.
look like cupids or angels, right? In the technical language of art historians, they are putai, but that means just in fancy language what you folks just said. What's interesting about this is 2 things. First of all, their naked forms is notable. We'll see something more about that a little bit later on. And notably, this is in a religious book, right? I mean, this includes prayers, blessings and so forth. Beyond that, though, I often have people respond and say, angels? Well, first of all, Jews didn't believe in angels, though that's not right. Jews, of course, did believe in angels. But we're less comfortable with that. But more particularly, the images of the angels would seem to be contrary to the second of the 10 commandments, which say that you're not supposed to create images. Well, whether that commandment was ever observed, it certainly wasn't observed during this period. And Jews, like their Christian neighbors, did not hesitate to represent images, even images of heavenly creatures.
Right.
Okay, so we see that on this page. I'm going to give you another page here. This is a beautiful, beautiful page. This is from another workshop, but it helps to make the same point. So you can see, those of you who may know part of this tradition, this is the beginning of Pirkei Avot, the so-called teachings of the fathers, or saying of the fathers, which is learned or recited on Sabbath afternoons in the summer as part of the ritual cycle. And in order to illustrate Moses receiving the Torah at Sinai, we've got a very, very fine image of Moses on Sinai, right? So we've got the fence that separated the people off from the mountain. We've got some flames, which I take to be, something resembling the burning bush. Moses at the top, right? And that's actually not a bad representation of Charlton Heston. I think you will all agree, right? But when we look at the Jews at the foot of Mount Sinai, we're going to look up and down. So let's begin with the crowd down below. Again, if I were to present you with this image here, just in isolation, and ask you, are these people Jewish? How would you respond? Right? Not obviously.
I don't look at, no.
Right? Not obviously. If we assume that Jews look different from their neighbors, right? And that would be a wrong assumption, but we've often heard that, then we would actually arrive at the wrong conclusion, which is that these aren't Jews. Obviously, standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, these are meant to be Jews. But a Jewish artist representing Jews at Mount Sinai looks at the Jews around him, and lo and behold, the Jews around him look just like the Christians around him. There's literally nothing to distinguish Jewish dress from Christian dress in this period. Now, when you look up, right, interestingly, we've got heaven. What's coming out of heaven here?
Angel.
the tablets, right, of the Ten Commandments. Here, I just want to remark, if any of you want to do a little bit of interesting historical inquiry, you can see that the top of the tablets is obviously rounded the way we think of the tablets. You should know that this was not the way the tablets were represented in the ancient world or even into the medieval world. The rabbis speak of the tablets. I mean, first of all, the Torah doesn't tell us about their shape beyond suggesting tablets. The common assumption of the rabbis is that they were actually square or rectangular. And we've got rabbinic statements to that effect. We don't know where this rounded image came from, but this provides us at least with some part of the history. But you'll notice as well, here we've got one of the angels who's blowing a shofar from heaven, another shofar coming through, the heavenly separation. This is because the Torah, of course, says that the voice of the shofar was heard at Mount Sinai. But once again, the artist doesn't hesitate to give us the image of the angel emerging from heaven, an image we would assume should be forbidden, but with which the artist here is quite comfortable, living as he does in Italy of this period, right? Here's another very, very nice page. I don't want to expand upon this, just to point out the image here. You'll notice the man sitting on a rug on the floor, reading a book. This is the liturgy for the 9th of Av, when in mourning we're supposed to be sitting on the floor. So that's this page, right? Just another beautiful, beautiful page. I couldn't help but include several of these. There are dozens of them, right? But these are good representations of them. Again, there's beyond the Hebrew, no reason to notice anything beyond the fact that these are good 15th century Italian pieces of art. I would note at the bottom here, there seems to be an African figure,
Yeah.
right? Not with dark skin, but clearly with darkened skin. These works were produced in and around Venice, and Venice was an international trading port. And of course, it connected the Italian peninsula to other parts of the Mediterranean, including Africa. And so people with darker complexions were very commonly seen in Venice and surroundings of the time. Again, that's probably what you see here. Okay, here, this is the one work I wanted to show you that is not in our collection, but it has connections to our collection. You can see that this is in the collection of the British Library. It is, as it's identified, a prayer book. The scribe is the same scribe that we saw before who wrote the prayer book for the young woman for her wedding. Okay, so we've got the scribal signature. We know who he was. And we don't know who did this very, very fine sketch. We'll see another example of this in a moment. But I'm going to actually give you a little quiz here because there is some part of the Hebrew that you can see. This is a woman who is doing what? What is she represented as performing or reciting? Anybody figure out enough of the Hebrew to locate it?
Mm-mm.
Okay, I see you only have part of the Hebrew, so it's a challenge. She's reciting Havdalah.
Okay.
Right? I mean, up at the top of Lo of Chad, Kiyoziva Zimrat Yada, Vayihili Lishua, and so forth. So it's a woman holding a wine goblet, a very, very elaborate wine goblet, which is clearly decorated with jewels and the like, even though it's not painted. She herself is adorned and in beautiful, beautiful dress. And I draw attention to the way her hair is set. You'll notice this fashion of pulling the hair back tightly, exposing a large part of the forehead and even shaving the front of the forehead, and then this kind of hair dress. This was typical for upper class Italian women at the time. And this Jewish woman, who again, if this were in any other book, you would not identify as Jewish, is clearly a member of that upper class. Remarkably, she is also a participant in Jewish ritual, right? And that may be as surprising to us as anything else. Jews as nobility, Jews as wealthy, and Jewish women as participating and even leading ritual. Here's a very nice, another image sketched out a little bit more quickly, apparently for the same woman. You can see that her back is bent. She's holding her hands in the fashion of prayer. And it's marked on the top. It says vidui. What's vidui?
Confession.
Confession, that's right. So she's probably participating in the Yom Kippur confession here. But again, we are not to imagine that men are involved in the liturgy and the ritual and women aren't. On the contrary, she is an active participant in the observances of the year, something that is not all that different from what we see in conservative synagogues, but something that might well surprise those who are accustomed to Ashkenazi Orthodox synagogue practice, right? So this is a very fine example. Here we've got, we're actually staying with the same scribe. This is from later on in his lifetime. 1516, he died only a couple of years after this. Avram Farisal once again, heavily stained. Notice that this is again Halach Ma'anya, the page which says this is the bread of affliction and invites people in. You've got the word Ha here at the top. It's beautifully decorated, though not painted in any way. And then we've got at the bottom here a table scene. Now, I think I just heard someone chuckle. Did I hear someone chuckle?
Yes, it was me. I just thinking the Last Supper is what it almost looked
beautiful. So I was about to ask, what does this remind you of? And before I got a chance to ask the leading question, you responded and said, well, this looks just like the Last Supper. And indeed it does. I've asked this question 100 times of people if I've asked it once. And every single time I get the same answer without any hesitation. Well, the Last Supper was actually painted during the very same century as what we've got here in the manuscript in front of us, which tells us, I don't believe for a moment that the Last Supper was influenced by Jewish painting. What I believe is that Jews participated in the larger artistic culture so completely that you can see us using the same idiom, the same kind of representation as was used even by some of the world's most famous artists. And this is a very fine example of that. This is a little bit later in the same, again, it's a Haggadah. And look at the gentleman here. You'll notice that it says here, Maror Zeh. So as a little fact, this green leaf, I could have given you a little, a quiz here and said, what is this? And unless you noticed the Hebrew, you wouldn't have known. But maror was bitter greens for most of its history. The custom of Ashkenazi Jews of using horseradish is a much later development. So what we see here shows us unambiguously what normal maror was. But when we look at this individual, right, again, if you didn't see him in this manuscript, how would you have identified him?
It's a wealthy person.
Yes, and there, again, nothing whatsoever to identify him as a Jew. This is good, noble Italian dress. His head is not covered, right? I mean, again, I've made the point, and there's no point in beating it, too repeatedly. But this is a really, really good and obvious example of that. Here we've got this in our collection. This is a printed work. It's the very famous Venice Haggadah. I don't remember the exact year. It's the early 16th century, 20-ish, 15 teens. If I'm remembering correctly. It's first of all, it shows what print was able to do. This is the 10 plagues, and it's the illustration of the 10 plagues. I mean, that's first of all worth noting. What's interesting though is, you may not be able to make this out, what we've got here on the side. So it's clearly what we would call Hebrew letters, but this word here is sangve. Here you've got peste, right? Then I'm trying to see if I can make this out myself. I mean, you could go through the examples. What you've got, oh, here's pestale, right over here on the left. What you've got here is actually an Italian translation of the Hebrew of the Haggadah. Now, they assume that the Jews reading this knew how to read Hebrew letters, but they did not assume that they knew how to translate the Hebrew, right? Which tells us, precisely as we would expect, that if Jews had education, the education was education in Hebrew letters, but that doesn't mean that they were comfortable with Hebrew. And of course, the normal language for Jews living in Italy was Italian, just as we saw, Jews living in Arab lands, Muslim lands spoke Arabic, or whatever the local language was. So the Venice printers were very clever. When they first began printing the Haggadah, they printed 3 editions of it. One with an Italian Hebrew translation, also known as Judeo-Italian. One with a Judeo-Spanish translation, which we know of as Ladino, and one with a Yiddish translation. This enabled them to sell their Haggadahs in Poland, in Spain, in Italy, and this was a bestseller as far as we can tell from the records. Here's another example from the same early printed Haggadah with its wonderful illustrations. Okay.
Wow.
I think this is the last image I've got for you, if I'm remembering this correctly. Italy, right? We're now in the 1600s, the latter part of the 17th century. Jewish life in Italy continued to be actually, for the most part, quite good. We've got Jewish diaries from significant figures who lived in Italy during this period, and they make it clear how fully they participated. This is a Megillah, right? A Megillah for Purim, as you can see. And there are illustrations throughout, but we show the opening panel here. This is the very beginning of the Megillah. If you look at the architecture, the structure of the panels, right? If you've been in any Renaissance period structure in Italy, primarily cathedrals, but others as well, you will have seen columns that look just like this. But listen, if you're in Italy, the nude female form is not going to shock you, right? What would shock us is to see it at the beginning of a religious document, the Megillah, right? You can't imagine the guy with pious, right, who had this he wouldn't have it in his possession, but you can imagine if he says, oh yeah, I forgot my Megillah, and someone says, no problem, let me give you this one, how he would respond.
Well, maybe it's Vashti.
Yeah, there you go. If we were to open it up. But, once again, what we see here literally there's another page from it. What we see over and over again, which by this point in these 2 sessions shouldn't surprise us, is how fully Jews have lived in their homes, in their settings, wherever they have found themselves, speaking the language, wearing the clothes, decorating their manuscripts and so forth. This, of course, didn't mean that they didn't have powerful Jewish identities, but it means that they didn't see their Jewish identities as being compromised by participating in the larger culture. We've also seen that, upper class women, right, were educated, were literate, participated in prayer. There are many, many things that emerge from this, and very little of it would be known without our preservation of these materials. So I'm going to stop my sharing. We've got just a few more minutes, and I welcome your questions and comments. I hope that you've found this both edifying and inspiring in its beauty. Yeah, Marilyn.
Well, 2 comments. One, that's probably one of the reasons why later on Jews had to wear some kind of identifying mark, because otherwise they looked like everybody else.
Yeah, and that could be a problem. That's right. And there were times, by the way, during this period that the church tried to enforce that. I mean, different times,
Yes,
but more typically not. And even if there was a rule, listen, Jews often ignored it because their neighbors didn't insist.
Right, exactly. It was only when they did.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is you noted that with some of these very rich manuscripts like the Rothschild, of course, they have the gold, but also the blue. Blue is a very expensive dye. It's made from ground up lapis lazuli. And there are places, I mean, some of the things like heaven, it makes sense to make it blue, but some of it, the background for the words, for example, this is essentially showing off.
Yeah,
I mean, beautiful.
Yeah.
It's stunning.
It is. And this manuscript, page after page after page, is meant to illustrate to anybody whose eye it catches how wealthy the family is.
Yeah, and the blue would also do that. To a lesser extent, the green. Those are really expensive colors.
Well, thank you for adding that. I appreciate it. And yes, Les.
What is the difference between an early modern Maxor and what is called a miscellany?
That's a good question. Sometimes there is no difference. The terms are used interchangeably. But when something is called a miscellany, that more typically is not organized according to the cycle of the Jewish year. It is simply, listen, if you're going to have a manuscript produced, or you're going to ask that, you're not going to have a lot of opportunity, right? I mean, if you're going to spend a lot of money and have a scribe work on something, often what they did was say, put in it everything that I think I'm going to need. Right? And so the miscellany actually often was simply by agreement with the scribe, between the scribe and the sponsor. It's that, this is what the sponsor felt they needed in the one most beautiful or most expensive work that they owned. Okay, I think I saw Hillary. Was your hand before?
Yeah, the thing that struck me, I don't know, maybe it's just me. The colors, the beautiful, I got all that. I was surprised to see vowels. I would think back then that they didn't put vowels on all the words.
Oh, thank you for noticing that. You find vowels in liturgy and in biblical texts. In other texts, you almost never find vowels. Okay? Huh. The reason you find vowels in liturgy and biblical texts, in biblical texts, it's twofold. The first is because the Bible needs to be pronounced in a very specific way in order to have the meaning that the tradition intends it to have. And if you pronounce it differently, you're going to change the meaning. So for the Bible, it's very important, both for biblical texts and for the liturgy. The people who were reading it were often not educated enough to actually know how to read without vowels. Right? I mean, we often think of the traditional Jewish world as being highly educated. It just ain't the case. Education was expensive, right? It was, if you're going to pay for the education of someone, it was going to be your sons and not your daughters under ordinary circumstances. And most education was rather primary. It didn't go on to secondary levels. So for all of those reasons, in the books that were used by common people, prayer books, right, biblical text, you find the vowels. In rabbinic works, you never find vowels because that's used only by scholars, and scholars know exactly how to pronounce it. Okay, anything else?
I have a question about the one Siddur where we looked at the Birchot HaShachar, the morning blessings, where we had Sha'asitani Isha, that made me a woman. Is there any work where someone has looked at that and sort of when that first appeared and when it disappeared and we lost that?
So the only evidence for it is in this and one other manuscript and in a French translation that probably originated, the tradition of the translation originated in northern Italy. There was close contact over the Alps between northern Italy and nearby France. And so, you know, for all we know, it was only a small number of women in Italy at this time, and maybe only those who, I mean, if we didn't have the French translation, we might guess that it was only those who were, you know, using manuscripts written by Farisol, since both of the manuscripts that included are Farisol manuscripts. The French translation is a little bit more suggestive. But again, we have no evidence for it before or after elsewhere. And so anything we would say would be a matter of guessing. I see that some people are logging off, so I wanted to just, you know, make my final statement before someone else does. I hope that this has helped you to appreciate the beauty and the value, you know, for all levels of learning of the JTS Library. And if you're inclined to make a donation, we do a lot of work that we consider important, so we wouldn't turn it away. And I hope that if you're interested in the library and want to learn more, that you feel free to get in touch with me, because I would welcome it. And I reiterate my invitation from last time that when we open up and people can travel again, we will get a bus from your community, and you know, you'll all come and see these and other works in person.
Thank you.
Well,
sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Dr.
you
Kramer,
so
thank you
much.
so much for your words. I mean, this is just an incredible treasure that you have shared with us. We do want to see it in person, and we are thankful that you are with us in as much person as we can do these days. And the ability to learn with you is truly a pleasure, a treat, and a privilege. So thank you so much. And I would echo, you know, JTS does amazing things. This is just a small taste, and I can't wait to share more, both in person and just from the teachings that your rabbis bring, which is really the Torah of JTS each and every Shabbat, and even more frequently than that. So thank you, and as we're getting close, so Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, Shabbat Shalom, and everybody be well, and enjoy your Thanksgivings, even if only at a distance.
Yes.
Okay.